We've finally made it. The last of the 8th Doctor monthly range, and the end of an era for Big Finish, and so far it's been somewhat of a mixed bag. I'm really not meaning to be negative with these ones. Only 4 left though, so let's just get into it. Something Inside is one of those stories that feels like it could have been great, but it fails in some very critical ways. The Doctor tries to take his companions to some sort of an epic space festival, only for the TARDIS to take them somewhere dark, gloomy, and made of metal. So their usual Thursday. They immediately run into some bloke who's screaming in agony and clutching at his head, which promptly explodes. Then they run into a bunch of telepaths, and then the Doctor is gone, and then Carissa's gone, leaving Charlie alone and in the hands of a bunch of psychics who have a habit of expositing all of their life stories and character traits, and have no concept of personal privacy because they keep reading her thoughts. I hope you like over-the-top expository dialogue, because that's what makes up a good chunk of this story. Charlie quickly learns from her overly chatty companions that they're veterans of a war that involved turning regular people into telepaths. The plan was to reverse the process and reintegrate them into society, but it didn't work. So after they won the war, the government just decided to throw them into a hyper prison called the Cube, which is specifically designed to hold telepaths. There's a political commentary somewhere in there, but it's very underdeveloped. Something about soldiers being made to do monstrous things and then being mentally scarred when they come back and abandoned by society. But the characters are also sort of an oppressed minority. It's like they put 2 allegories in a blender and just made a huge mess that stunk up the place. It pays a lot of homage to the 90s movie Cube, an excellent piece of techno-horror where a bunch of people find themselves in a prison made out of cube-shaped compartments, most of which contain some sort of cruel and unusual bizarre saw traps. The prisoners have to work together, but there's no trap in this one. Instead, they're just running through metal corridors, trying to escape a thing called the brain worm, while expositing their backstories like they're reading directly from their own personal character pages. This isn't exactly a visual medium, but honestly, show don't tell. Anything that you tell the audience can be nowhere near as engaging as if you had just shown them. And yeah, this isn't a visual medium, but show don't tell does sort of apply here, especially in a full cast audio drama where the setting and what's happening and the characters and the scenes are all gotten across with clever dialogue and sound effects. Most audio dramas deal with telling the backstory of a character by jumping to flashback scenes. This is really effective and Big Finish do them all the time. You can also tell the audience a lot about a character by just how they interact with other characters and how they respond to certain situations. Their likes, dislikes, where they come from, their general temperaments, strengths, and character flaws. You can get all of this across without even saying it outright. But in this story, all of it is done through long, explainy dialogue, making this play an absolute slog, which is a shame. Anyway, while Charlie is having her ear talked off, the Doctor and Caris have been taken by the people running the place, and they are being tortured and interrogated because they want to know who they are, where they came from, and how they broke into their top secret high security gulag. But the Doctor can't answer their questions because, and say it with me now, the 8th Doctor has amnesia. The 1st Doctor smacks bottoms, the 4th Doctor has really nice teeth, the 6th Doctor wouldn't look out of place at a pride parade, and the 8th Doctor gets amnesia.
Does anyone here not have amnesia? I don't know.
This is getting ridiculous. You know what? I'm bringing back the counters. And another thing, even without any memory, he still finds a reason to be a dismissive prick towards Caris, right after Caris experienced horrific torture for the Doctor's sake. Next we have Memory Lane. The Doctor has his memories back, so he takes the TARDIS to the living room of a lovely old granny, who seems very unconcerned that her 30-year-old grandson thinks he's 10. She also isn't concerned that a London police box has just appeared in her living room, nor that it contains an Edwardian adventuress, a guy dressed as a 19th century sex pest, or a lizard man that changes colour. She is far more concerned that they are blocking the television. The TARDIS team, after agreeing to a cup of tea, step outside and find what looks like a typical London street, with identical connected houses. And each of those identical houses contains an identical old granny. But only one of them contains the TARDIS, but they don't have to look for long, because the ice cream man flogged it, trapping them on an endless London street with identical houses with nothing better to do than play Lego, eat ice cream, and watch the telly, before Charlie's mum calls her home and scolds her for hanging out with the lower classes again. This is exactly the kind of weird that I come to Big Finish for, so just give it a listen. Next we have Carissa's final episode, Absolution. He's had a bit of a hard time in the TARDIS so far, while with escaping a murder cult, mercy killing his wife, and being exiled from his universe to become completely dependent on the Doctor and Charlie, one of whom pretends everything is fine while not actually trusting him, while the other excludes him from things and is a dismissive prick. I mean, sure, he does have a bit of a mean streak, and he thinks that killing people is saving them, actually. And believe me, we will get to that, but he's overall a good guy with a good heart. And he's come to think of the TARDIS as his home, and Charlie and the Doctor as his family. The younger sister he somewhat gets along with, and the weird uncle who is only nice to you in front of other people. Absolution opens with Charlie and Kariz hanging out in Kariz's bedroom. He's showing her some stuff they brought with him from his homeworld. And Charlie picks up this one thing that has weird blue glowing crystals on it. And she just can't help but open it. Then everything goes dark, the TARDIS is all messed up, and then it isn't, and then the TARDIS winds up in this place that's full of fire and brimstone, and the screaming souls of the damned, and the Doctor decides that it's hell. No other context, it's just hell, and he's not talking figuratively, mind you. He hypothesizes that this was the original inspiration for hell, because why not? After all, every culture has a myth of hell and damnation, except for the ones that don't. The ancient Greeks, despite modern bastardizations of their mythology, didn't believe in hell. They have an underworld, which was basically where anyone went, and Hades, despite being the lord of this less glamorous of the realms, was not comparable to Satan. That's just modern writers being lazy. The Norse also didn't have a hell. They have Valhalla, where warriors who died in battle go to drink and party with the gods for all eternity, and then they have their version of the underworld where everybody else goes. Not a place of punishment, just a less glamorous version of the other place, and is overseen by Hel, daughter of Loki, whose name is completely incidental, and is also not comparable to Satan. There's versions of Judaism that don't believe in hell, there's also many flavors of Christianity that don't believe in hell, and numerous other religions, and that's just on Earth. But anyway, after the Doctor is done talking out of his ass, stuff happens. Kariz becomes separated from them, and the console fills with blood. Blood that happens to be genetically identical to Charlie. This is the TARDIS way of signaling that something is wrong, and the cloister bells just won't cut it. They exit the TARDIS and find themselves in a medieval fortress in the middle of hell. Some sort of a force field is holding back this giant monster thingy, and the place is being run by this absolute freaking zealot and his daughter who has clearly read some Hitchings. Meanwhile, Kariz meets an old bloke who convinces him that he's actually a god, and he mentors him in his powers that he has here for some reason. As far as Extra stories go, this one is okay, but it's also a bit of a waste of potential, especially with everything that they've built up about Kariz in his past. And if you want to avoid spoilers, skip to this timecode, because this part is so weird and so interesting that I can't help but talk about it. Turns out Kariz is not just a lizard boy. Here's people attempting to achieve some form of immortality so they can escape the fate that is the constant death loop of that universe. You see, the murder cult that Kariz was a part of, the Church of the Foundation, they ritualistically kill people because they believe that they're saving them, and they are literally saving them. They store their souls in these things that are called absolvers. Kariz doesn't actually need an absolver, he actually is an absolver. He's genetically modified to harbour all of the souls of his civilization. Isn't that lovely? That's why he still hears the voices of the people he's killed. They're all still alive in him. He's killed a lot of people, but he has saved just as many as he has killed, and wait a minute.
4,022 saved. No survivors.
Moffat, you hack! Hello people who skipped to this timecode. Unfortunately, the ending of this episode forms the beginning of the next, so I'm going to have to spoil it for you. So, Kariz is dead. He has sacrificed himself for the rest of the TARDIS crew and everybody else. And the Doctor is just like, well, everything back to normal then. So, Charlie, you're a little bit sad. Let's check out a show to cheer you up. And naturally he would. The Doctor is over 900 years old at this point. He has seen a lot of people come and go, so he's just a little bit desensitized to that by now. And he also didn't really like Kariz. I've been ripping on him this entire time for him being a dismissive prick, and there's a reason for that. People who go through traumatic experiences tend to associate that trauma with people who are present for it. And the Divergent Universe was a very traumatic experience for the Doctor. One of his primary senses was cut off, in a permanent state of deprivation. He described it as being like hell, and Kariz just so happens to be a walking, talking, scaly exoskeleton reminder of that experience. This doesn't justify the Doctor's dickishness towards him, mind you, it just makes it a little bit more understandable. But Charlie does not understand. She doesn't understand any of it. Seeing how little the Doctor cares about the death of someone who she thought was his friend, and how easily he can move on, it makes her wonder just what will happen when she eventually dies. He wonders if he even grieves for any of his companions who he leads to their deaths. All this forces her to see the Doctor and their adventures together in a completely different light. She can't see him the same way anymore, so she decides that she has to get off. Absolution is not exactly what I would call the best of what Big Finish has to offer. I would even call it a bit of a letdown. It's a rushed mess and squandered any potential that these audios could have built up to, but I cannot overstate just how good this scene is. It is heartbreaking. In Stu Dagfall's 8th Doctor series, he compares this scene to the one with Clara in the end of Kill the Moon, when she confronts the Doctor, and I think that's a perfect comparison. At times, the Doctor doesn't really realise how he treats people, and he also doesn't realise how the situations he puts people in will affect them in the long run. This incarnation of the Doctor is particularly dense when it comes to emotional intelligence, with devastating effect, and it's good to see him finally confronted with that. All of this leads into the final story, The Girl Who Never Was. This way is a perfect send-off for one of my favourite companions. It's sad, melancholic, but altogether beautiful. And in it you can see the DNA for one of the greatest companion exits in New Who, and also the worst one. But I'm getting ahead of myself. It takes place immediately after Absolution, and Charlie is still determined to leave the TARDIS. The Doctor doesn't want to leave things on bad terms, so instead of taking her to the crash site of the airship R101, he decides to take her to Singapore, where she was originally going to go in the first place. But the TARDIS has been thrown off by some sort of timey-wimey thing, so instead of Singapore in the 1930s, they're instead in 2008. Which Charlie has taken as the final betrayal. She should have died, so she has no place in time or space. If she were to go home, see her family, and pick up where she left off, it would mean one big paradox. And the Doctor taking her to 2008, well after her family's time, makes her think that the Doctor doesn't trust her. So she leaves him a letter at the hotel, and she meets an Australian named Byron, who is an absolute bastard. And she soon finds herself stuck in one last adventure with the Doctor, on a boat full of treasure that disappears in 1942. Oh, if you thought I'd make it through an entire video without doing a history time. Frankly, I'm disappointed in you. January 1942, World War II, the War in the Pacific, the Battle of Singapore. Early in the war, Prime Minister John Curtin warned Churchill of the impending threat of Japanese expansion, particularly in how it would affect Australia and Britain's other allies in the Pacific, only to be broadly ignored. Granted, the UK did have problems of their own at the time, but their inaction to protect their allies and their holdings resulted in mass death on a scale that is very difficult to comprehend. It also forced us to align ourselves with the United States because they actually seem to not want us to be invaded. We've been their faithful lapdog ever since. One time they even did a coup on us because our Prime Minister wanted to nationalise our resources, but that's neither here nor there. Singapore was the foremost British military base and economic stronghold in Southeast Asia, and a massive part of the British inter-war defence strategy. More importantly for Australia, it was the one thing standing between us and impending Japanese invasion. I mean, look how close it is. I was actually surprised how close it was. I know geography. Churchill ordered them to fight to the last man against the invading Japanese, 30,000 strong and fresh from their Malayan campaign. The Allied forces did outnumber them, but they were undersupplied and inexperienced. On the 8th of February, the Japanese attacked the weakest part of the island's defences and established a beachhead. They then advanced, bombing as they went, forcing the Allies back until the 15th, when they were forced to surrender. Around 80,000 British, Indian, Australian and local troops were made prisoners of war. Most of them died from abuse, neglect and forced labour. Churchill called it the worst disaster in British military history. And apparently he also blamed the Australian troops. I have a mate who idolises this guy, and I get it. By all accounts, he was a great man, with a lot of admirable traits to emulate. He was a military genius, a proud patriot, and under his leadership, Britain was seen through some of its darkest days. He made a lot of pretty speeches, and he makes for a very adorable, sometimes companion. But he was also a bastard. He voted against women getting the vote, he couldn't keep his pants on, and he was drinking champagne and smoking cigars at the height of the Blitz. What was I talking about? Oh, alright, okay. Many civilians were trapped on the island, but there were some who escaped. Before and during the siege, a lot of boats made flight. Many full to the brim with civilians fleeing Japanese occupation, while others were full of rich people and their stuff.
The women and children, those that could, they left on the official boats.
But a certain breed of rich colonial fellas, they was jiggered if they was being left behind in Singapore.
Jiggered if they were leaving their antiques, their artworks, their cars, even their gold to the invading enemy.
The ghost ship that Charlie and the Doctor find themselves on is one of the latter variety. Anyway, Charlie manages to get herself stranded in 1942, where she meets Byron's granddad, who looks and sounds exactly like Byron. Meanwhile, the Doctor is in the same boat, only in 2008, where he's joined by Byron and his mother, who seems very familiar, also Cybermen. This story is dense and multi-layered and very difficult to talk about without getting too far into spoilers. It goes out of its way to highlight all of the greatest aspects of the Doctor and Charlie's relationship, how she has developed as a character, and how special their bond is, while also showing exactly why it needs to end. And they leave things off in a way that is sad, but overall very satisfying, and really fits with the characters, and it's not at all undercut by the fact that she starts travelling with the Sixth Doctor after this. This story is brilliant in so many ways, but one thing that annoys me a little is Byron. He's an Australian, a con man, treasure-hunting bastard with a pretty terrible attempt at an Australian accent. In British theatre, there's an accent called General American. It doesn't exactly sound like someone you'd meet in the US of A, but it's enough for the audience to know that this character is supposed to be American. For absolutely no reason, I'm going to do the rest of this video in an over-the-top Australian accent. Now, mate, this story is very good, an excellent send-off for one of my favourite companions, and unfortunately, I can't talk about it too much without spoiling the entire thing, so I'm just gonna say listen to it and leave it at that. Leave something in the comments if you know the bit that I'm talking about where Moffat and Davies ripped it off. It's blatant, and they're about as subtle as a brick in both cases. So, that's your bloomin' lot, mate. It's been good having you all here. Overall, I've enjoyed this trip down memory lane, listening to the 8th Doctor monthly range. Frankly, I love this run of the 8th Doctor plays. It's flawed in some bits, yes. It's experimental and not all of it lands, but when it hits, it hits. The 8th Doctor monthlies contain some of the best Doctor Who stories you'll ever see. And I'll tell you, mate, they really took a chance with this Doctor. They took the basis they left in the TV movie and developed the character into one of my favourite Doctors. He can be a bit of a prick at times, but one thing I love about this Doctor is the complexity. He's simultaneously the most human and most alien incarnation, and he's not a perfect person. He's flawed, and the centuries have left him jaded in more ways than he knows. He's a fan of humanity, sure, he likes the aesthetics, and he's a total fanboy for historical figures, especially the problematic ones. But he lacks any sort of emotional understanding, which at the very least leaves a lot of room for growth. The biggest shame with this era is that it had to end so abruptly, because for the first time, mate, in 16 years, Doctor Who was back on our screens, bringing with it a new tone, new story structure, and a new generation of fans experiencing it for the first time. And if Big Finish wanted to appeal to that audience, they needed to give them something more tuned to what the show was offering. Next time in this series, I'm doing the 8th Doctor Adventures, and I am really looking forward to it. Don't forget to comment, like, share, subscribe, click the bell if you want to get notifications every time I do a new video, which I promise I'm going to do more of. Work has been a little bit stressful lately, and this voice is getting really hard to keep up. So I'm going to leave it there, and I'll see you in the next one.